Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, the best, most informative, and greatest learning there is in the evaluation field. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Senior Communications Associate for DME for Peace at Search for Common Ground. I am currently in our headquarters in a somewhat cloudy Washington, D.C. Jack is away, so I'll be taking over as moderator for this session. So today I am delighted to welcome Sarah Repucci, Senior Director for Research and Analysis at Freedom House, and the author of their recent report, Freedom and the Media 2019, A Downward Spiral, which helped inspire today's conversation. So many thanks to Sarah, who will be leading our discussion on understanding the interplay between media and democracy. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. I will now hand it over to today's guest, Sarah. You're very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thanks to all of you for listening in today. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm our Director for Research and Analysis, which means that I oversee Freedom House's teams that produce the flagship research projects. So Freedom in the World, Freedom on the Net, and Nations in Transit. For anyone who isn't familiar with Freedom House, we're an NGO based in Washington that works to support democracy around the world. I'm based in our New York office where we produce all of the research. Actually, only a small portion of what we do is research. Most of my colleagues work on international programs to support human rights defenders around the world. Today, I'm going to speak about Freedom House's newest project, which is called Freedom in the Media. So I'm going to walk through how we developed Freedom in the Media and what we've learned from that process. I'll start by explaining what we were trying to accomplish, then tell you a bit about our methods. I'll then briefly summarize our main findings, and next I'll mention some of our lessons learned, and I'll conclude with what is in the works for us right now with the project. So before Freedom in the Media, Freedom House produced a project called Freedom of the Press for nearly 40 years. That project helped develop Freedom House's credibility in the area of press freedom and produced a lot of very valuable data over that time. We retired Freedom of the Press in 2017, and Freedom and the Media was developed to address three main shortcomings that we had seen in Freedom of the Press, the Freedom of the Press project. So first, that press freedom methodology was out of date. The project was telling us a lot about things like violence against journalists, which had been a really high priority when the project had been developed, but it wasn't talking as much as we wanted about the issues that I think everyone was really thinking about and is thinking about in terms of media around the world, things like polarization or disinformation or the struggling economic model for news outlets around the world. So that was the main shortcoming with the methodology itself. Second, the project was very difficult to fund, and we'd been running a deficit. And third, ultimately, Freedom House is a democracy organization, and press freedom organizations like Reporters Without Borders produce their own press freedom indicators and can integrate them with their wider agenda all year long. Freedom House, as a democracy organization, couldn't keep up on the press freedom front. So when we were thinking about developing Freedom in the Media, we wanted to address these three shortcomings. So to delve into the most relevant current themes, to capitalize on Freedom House's niche as an organization that supports the spread of democracy around the world, and to do it in a sustainable way. So with that in mind, the goal that we set, kind of the mission of Freedom in the Media is that we will provide analysis and data on how well the media are supporting democratic values and how the media are manipulated to undermine democracy. So tying the media into democracy in order to make it more closely aligned with our mission. So for the first edition of Freedom in the Media, we thought that we could experiment a bit rather than lock ourselves into a formal methodology the way we already had with our other projects. We wanted to spend a little bit of time exploring different ways that we could go about this. So Freedom House is known for pairing data with analytical reports, but generally what we do is we have a methodology to collect the data and we pair that with unique analytical reports that go with that methodology. For Freedom in the Media this year, we wanted to maintain the pairing of data with analysis, but we didn't have the capacity to develop an entirely new methodology this year. So we used data that we had already collected on media freedom from our other reports, and especially from Freedom in the World. I'll explain briefly how we collect data for Freedom in the World, since I think it's relevant and somewhat interesting. So Freedom in the World covers political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories around the world. We have a standard methodology that we apply to each country, and that methodology has 25 indicators. Freedom House hires a team of more than 100 analysts all around the world to collect data on their respective countries based on our methodology. And then using this research, they propose 25 scores according to the methodology, and then they also provide narrative explanations of those scores. We then gather in a series of 7 regional review meetings to discuss all of the scores among the staff, the analysts, and also a team of senior academic advisors who come in for this purpose. We go country by country and score by score, and we use the previous year's scores as the baseline. So we compare countries to each other and to themselves over time, and we determine the final scores that way. Through that process, just one of those scores is about press freedom. So that's the one that we pulled out for Freedom in the Media this year. For the analytical portion of Freedom in the Media, we used our other reports as a foundation to identify key themes that we wanted to explore in more depth. So based on Freedom in the World, Freedom on the Net, and Nations in Transit, these are the 4 themes that we identified, and they're up on the slide. So we looked at the global state of media freedom based on this Freedom in the World data. We looked at the ways that China is manipulating media in less repressive societies. We looked at new techniques that are being used, particularly in Serbia and Hungary, as case studies in the manipulation of the media and weakening of democratic institutions. And we looked at social media and the ways that it's being used to support democracy and the ways it's being used to undermine democracy. Because we were working on a small budget this year, we selected members of our staff, our Freedom House staff, to write analytical essays on each of these themes. So I'll speak briefly about our main findings. So again, just to be clear, what we released this June, which was our first release, was just these 4 essays. And then we had this heat map, which shows just that one score from Freedom in the World and how each country performs. So the darker colors are worse and the lighter colors are better. Very briefly, I'll just share some of the top line findings from the analytical essays. So first, our data showed that media freedom has been deteriorating around the world for the past decade. And we're seeing new forms of repression taking hold in democracies and also innovative methods being used in authoritarian states. Second, we found that populism is really having a genuine impact on media freedom in major democracies. The countries that we've been watching closely, in addition to the special essay on Hungary and Serbia, are India, Israel, and also the United States and Brazil. The threats to global media freedom are very real and concerning in their own right. But from the Freedom House perspective, it's their impact on the state of democracy that makes them truly dangerous. And that is why we feel it's important to do this focused project on media freedom and why we're continuing to track this. All that said, we have seen that press freedom can rebound from even lengthy stints of repression. We did have some positive stories this year, especially in Ecuador and Ethiopia and Malaysia. So Freedom House really feels that there is a basic human desire for democratic liberties, and that this includes access to honest and fact-based journalism. And it gives us hope that going forward, the steep decline can be reversed. So I'll talk now a bit about some of our lessons learned. Freedom House has quite a strong existing reputation for analysis on press freedom based on our prior work. So there's kind of a baseline of attention that we get whenever we release something on this subject that's fairly high. So when we released the report in June, it was very well received by the media, and we had many prestigious media hits. We also had the opportunity to brief staff members of the House Press Freedom Caucus, and the staff has been invited for interviews and conferences, and even to testify in a hearing on Capitol Hill. And all of that was very much due to the release of this project. So in our experience, doing work of this kind definitely does raise the profile of the organization and is an opportunity to put the organization's experts out there in a public way, which then leads to a sort of a virtuous circle of external inquiries for expertise. The piece on Hungary and Serbia in particular had quite an impact in Serbia. This here is a picture of President Vučić. Journalists there have been decrying the decline in press freedom for quite some time. After the release of our report, journalists in Serbia very publicly held up our report as proof of President Vučić's repressive techniques, and they called on the government to respond. And after a couple of weeks of this, Vučić did respond, and it showed that we clearly touched a nerve with him. Of course, he didn't admit to any wrongdoing or promise any change, but having such an explicit response from the target government was really quite a great sign for us of having reached the audience we were trying to reach. I think, it was really a combination of factors that did this. It was being in the right place at the right time. But we've definitely been exploring how we can have this kind of effect more often. And, certainly countries where the leader doesn't feel secure, they're much more likely to respond than, say, in Hungary, where Prime Minister Orban basically ignored the report. I think fundamentally one of our greatest lessons from this project is that using data from Freedom in the World, as we did, was less than ideal. Really, what we need to do this kind of work is a dedicated data set. The conclusions that we were able to draw from this one indicator from Freedom in the World were quite limited. And I think it's unlikely that we would be able to find interesting things to say for a second year, but we would like to continue the project. People do know Freedom House for its data, and we've had quite a few queries about the data specifically, including requests for more granular information about media freedom than we've been able to provide. We also had citations of the more complex data from other Freedom House projects that then were actually tagged to Freedom in the Media, which was nice, but indicated that there was this kind of disconnect between people's understanding of what we were doing. So I think our major lesson was that we want to develop a dedicated data set for Freedom in the Media. So going forward, with that in mind, we are currently in the process of developing a new methodology that would create this data set. The goal is to address the three challenges that I laid out at the beginning. So capturing the most relevant trends of the day, capitalizing on our strength as a democracy organization, and sustainability. And to do all of that within this framework that I laid out of showing how the media support democracy and how they are manipulated to undermine democracy. To address the sustainability question, we are considering new methods of data collection that'll be less labor intensive than the massive team of analysts that I described before. So we're looking at techniques such as content analysis and natural language processing. We're not yet sure whether these techniques will be right for us, but we're actually quite excited about the possibilities, and we're exploring them very seriously. Our aim is to develop a new set of ideas for essays to be released next spring, and to have a new data set at that time as well. So if we can pull together the funding, we intend for this to be an annual project. Of course, a lesson that we know from our other projects is that index reports are very expensive to produce and very difficult to find fundraising for year after year. I'll stop there for now, but I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you, Sarah. That was really insightful. Okay, so we will now open up today's presentation for our questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion. And I also just want to say, I will try to pronounce names correctly. My apologies if I do mess up. So first, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and start us off with hopefully a pretty simple question, but interesting nonetheless. In addition to what you've already told us, were there any major surprises in the data that you just weren't expecting to see?
That's a great question. So I think that what was most interesting in the data was the way that that we're seeing a weakening of press freedom in many strong democracies around the world, but at the same time we are seeing this rebounding that I referred to before. So even though there is this very real decline, we're seeing positive change in countries that people had basically entirely given up on, like Ethiopia or Armenia or Angola. And when we were working on the report, it was also a time when there was, not now, but a lot more hope in places like Venezuela and Sudan. And we were thinking about, what it is that allows that to happen, and the very high degree of individual initiative that takes place in very repressive societies, and how that can really change the information that people get. So even though there's basically no independent information circulating in Venezuela right now, journalists have found these really innovative ways of creating apps to make recordings that can be transmitted through very low bandwidth, since of course bandwidth is at a premium right now in Venezuela, and there's all these massive electricity outages, and that those videos could be immediately deleted from the phone so the journalists couldn't be held accountable if they were arrested. Things like that, also a Facebook group in Sudan where it had started kind of as sort of a group of young girls who were basically talking about the boys that they found attractive. But it kind of morphed over time as the protests started in Sudan towards these girls keeping tabs on people who were standing out as members of security services and publishing their information on Facebook so that people would know who they were and would be able to watch out for them when they were, when arrests were happening at protests. So these kind of extremely innovative ways that people get around censorship and repression of various kinds of arrests in these countries that that are really so closed. So I think that for me was the most interesting part of the data.
All right, thank you, Sarah. We have a hand raised by Ted Perlmutter. Hopefully I got that right. Ted, I'm going to unmute your mic so that you can ask your question directly to Sarah. All right, you are unmuted.
Hi, Sarah. So it sounds like a very promising project. I guess my questions, I teach a course at the Columbia called Human Rights and Social Media. And the way I started the course last fall was actually, last spring, was talking about Khashoggi. And, which to me sort of raises a couple of questions. I mean, one of which is, sort of the relationship between focusing on mainstream media and then focusing on, sort of the broader social media questions. Because, I mean, to me, what did Khashoggi in was not just his relation to the standard press, but his efforts to sort of counter the kind of information warfare that was going on in Saudi Arabia. So one, I'm just sort of, suggesting that it's a case you might want to take a look at. But secondly, and more broadly, wondering how you're actually going to sort of, to what extent you intend to sort of map and track social media, and how you might do that, because I know if you're concerned about resources, that's not a cheap project.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been looking into services like Facebook's CrowdTangle, services that look at social media posts. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is comparing what the discourse looks like on social media to the discourse in either local media or in international media, and how closely they're tracking as a possible indication of repression, but also of the vibrancy of the information that people may be getting through sources other than traditional media. I think, it's really interesting the ways that social media have been used to circumvent traditional media, but also just as to distribute media when traditional media just aren't doing that job. I think WhatsApp groups in parts of Africa are really interesting in that regard, where journalists use WhatsApp to create media outlets that are functioning on that platform. That's their primary means of distribution. So we're looking at it from different angles. I will say that, the Khashoggi case is also interesting in what it says about governments reaching across borders in order to target their enemies. And that's a broader issue than just media, but it's also something that Freedom House is looking at very carefully. And we've actually started a new project specifically on that theme. So it's certainly a case that has a lot of implications, and something that we're working on in different ways.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'd actually like to follow up with you about Khashoggi afterwards. Just
yeah, I'd be happy to be in touch.
Am I teaching this stuff again? And I have a few other things to sort of mention about, sort of more academic work that's been done on, let's say, Germany and, the right-wing politics there, or France and the Gilets jaunes, that might be of interest if that's within your scope.
Yeah, certainly. Let's be in touch.
All right, thank you both. Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Sarah, for that. We have a few more questions rolling in. This one is from Kadoma Anthony. Here's the question. There's a paradox whereby, like in Uganda, the government has allowed media houses to open up and go ahead and stop or limit them on who or what they should air out to the public. My point is that we need to strengthen and or build the capacity of citizen journalism to share information rather than relying on established media houses, which are easy to stifle by the government in power. What are your thoughts on this, Sarah? Do you have any?
Yeah, certainly. I think that there's a place for both. So it's definitely true that the means of repression, it's much easier to repress traditional media outlets, and we see that in countries all over the world. citizens journalists, as I was saying, have filled that gap in a lot of countries and are playing a really important role. But I think that traditional journalists, even if their outlets can't serve that purpose, the institution of journalism, the training that people get, and the kind of the standards for professionalism that journalists practice it does bring a different angle. And also having journalists to help kind of curate the news and to put certain information out there in a world where we're all kind of flooded with information, and it can be really difficult to know what to turn to, what to look at first, who to trust. Having a team of trusted journalists can be really valuable. So those can be citizen journalists, but it does help when people are dedicated to the profession and are doing it over a sustained period of time. So I think there's a place for both.
Great. We have another question. This is from Susan Abbott, Media Development Consultant. Susan says, it's a pity to hear that the Press Freedom Index will change, as so many researchers and evaluation specialists depend on your data sets. Will this new vision for measuring press freedom continue to take the pulse of press freedom in a way that can be used for longitudinal analysis and for comparative research?
So thank you, Susan. I will say that I am among the many people who were really sad to see the Freedom of the Press report go. I absolutely know how valuable it was, and I know how important the longitudinal nature of it was for researchers. Unfortunately, the answer is no. We will not. The new project will not provide that kind of continuity because of the different focus of this report. And unfortunately, that is the reality of the fact that the people who find the report very valuable are not the people who can fund it, and the people who can fund it were not funding it. So it's that's the funding world that we're in, and unfortunately, that's where we are.
Sorry for the pause there. Okay, thank you for that. I just have a question, and you kind of touched on this a bit, but in an ideal situation, how would you like to see your current work and publications being done in research around press freedom, medium, and democracy? How would you like to see it expanded in the future? And ultimately, what impact would you like for it to have?
So in general at Freedom House, we've been trying to be much more targeted about who we're trying to reach, and we've found that we've been able to have a much greater impact when we have a small number, just 3 or 4 priority audiences, very specific audiences, so say not the media in general, but journalists who can write long-form analytical pieces on issues. Not policymakers in general, but members of the U.S. Congress who can pass laws to put pressure on foreign governments. So that is our strategy for this work. I think we're very excited at the possibility of contributing more to the conversation that people are having about democracy through this lens, and in thinking more about how the media can support democracy more and can help hold leaders to account. When we look at all of the different areas of democracy that Freedom House looks at in all of our work, after elections, I think press freedom is the one that we've identified as most important, at least for us. So I think we're excited to be part of these conversations that everyone is having right now, and to have data that can contribute to that and can further the discussion towards what can be done and how we can make things better.
Okay, great, thanks. This is a question that's a bit more specialized, so if you know don't feel like you have an answer for this, that's fine. I was just wondering, based off of your data and the case studies that you have been looking at and going through to put together these reports, do you have any advice for practitioners who would like to use media in their program designs to promote, say, peace building or human rights initiatives, but they're in some of these more fragile environments?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by using media.
For example, just some program designs for projects being done, use media to help kind of make an impact when it comes to peace building or human rights work, but they're in more fragile environments where there might not be as much freedom of the press. I didn't know if you had any advice for them that you might have learned from your data or case studies of how media is still, you know, getting out there and breaking through these barriers in these countries where it might be harder to have press freedom. Sorry if that didn't make sense or if you don't have an answer. It's just a question.
No, that makes sense. I think that the media, I mean, especially as we're thinking about the new methodology and what is it that the media can do ideally to support democracy, the role of consensus building in post-conflict situations or conflict situations is really important, and in helping to bridge divides and help people understand the other side of the story. Media have played a really important role in other post-conflict situations to help reconciliation. So I definitely think that role of information is really important, and you know, even though the media may be constricted in certain ways from talking about certain contentious topics, if there is a peace building situation, hopefully the government is on board with it, in which case it may be less contentious to cover these items. And so even if it's not the most free press in the world, it can still play a role in this. And I think having journalists understand the role that they can play in peace building and kind of take that call to action on can be really key to developing programs of that kind.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, knowledge is power. We've seen in some of our own program designs that being able to help local journalists know the rights that they have and the capabilities that they are allowed has really made a difference in being able to spread the messages and stories that need to be heard. Just one more question. Was there one or two sort of overall points that you would like our participants today to walk away with? And if there is, what would they be?
You know, I think one of the things I guess I struggled with as I was preparing this presentation is that, you know, every project is unique and every organization is unique, and it's hard to say that what we did would be useful for another organization. I think fundamentally what's most important is to know what your mission is, what your goal is, and to be very, very targeted about how the particular project that you're designing is going to contribute to that goal. And it's a cliche to say it, but it's so easy to fall back on these generalizations just to push through something that you think sounds like a good idea. And kind of your gut instinct that this is something that you should do. It's constantly bringing it back to the goal just reminds you of the little tweaks that you need to make, the slight changes, the way that you've kind of drifted off course a bit and need to pull it back. And so I think, more than the particular details of our project, applying that logic to everything is always what's most important.
All right, thank you. And I think unless there's anything else you would like to share with us today, Sarah, I think we're going to start wrapping things up. And I would like to thank everyone for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. This recording, just a reminder, will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk discussion page later today so that you are able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. So please continue to add to and build the discussion online in the comments section. Oh, sorry, I have one more question that actually just popped in. If you don't mind, do you have a second, Sarah? Would you mind answering?
No, sure, yeah.
Oh, yeah, great. So this is from Benedict Austin. Benedict from Nigeria, Benedict says, I would really like to know the new methodology being suggested and how it works.
So I don't have full details yet because we're really only in early stages right now. But basically what we're trying to do is develop just a handful of questions that we would want to answer. Things like, are the media able to hold those in power to account? Are the media able to cover controversial topics? Do people get the information that they need in order to make informed choices when voting? Those kinds of questions. So we're trying to kind of narrow that list down through consultation with a wide range of experts and through our own knowledge at Freedom House. Once we set that list of questions, we're exploring those other methods that I mentioned before, and whether we can partner with a technology firm or with some other experts who can help us develop a method of data collection. And in and of itself, that data collection will probably, that method will probably require us to further develop our methodology in order to gather the information. So I don't have more details than that right now, but please do stay tuned, and I very much hope that we will have a methodology to publish and new results next spring.
All right, thank you. And I have one more question from Nigeria. This comes from Charles Okoro. And I think we have time to answer this last question before we say goodbye today. So Charles asked, how do you measure media coverage and audience reach in media programming, example, radio programming?
So that has to be done with people on the ground. And regardless of what method we use, where we will always need to depend on people on the ground to give us information, not just what is covered in radio, but also to what extent do people use radio, where are people getting their news and information from. So I hope that answered your question, but we at Freedom House believe very strongly in using our networks and having people who can give us informed information from the ground, from the field.
All right, thank you. I think I'm going to wrap up the questions today just so that we have enough time. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And as I mentioned before, these Thursday Talk recordings will be posted on our M&E Thursday Talk page later today. So you can return to it and share it with your colleagues. And if you continue to have questions, or if you would like to add on to the questions that you asked and have more clarifications, then please feel free to continue the discussion in our comment section under the recording. And as for our next M&E Thursday talk, we'll be back on the 26th of September, where we will be talking with Dallin Van Leuven from Search for Common Ground about countering violent extremism. You can currently register for that webinar on our dmeforpeace.org website, but also keep an eye out for upcoming emails and social media posts that will act as reminders. Again, thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Sarah, for the presentation and for answering our questions. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your work week, and I look forward to hearing from all of you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.